Thank you, Angelo. Hi, everybody. Notice how I popped up as soon as he said my name, because he's telling us that we have to really be on time, so I'm trying. My charge tonight was to kind of try to make some meaning out of not just the ACES, but this whole movement around trauma and abuse. And certainly, these are troubled times for our culture, for our city. So I just want to kind of put into a frame of reference what the big deal is about ACES and why it is such a big deal. John Guare is a famous American playwright, and he was interviewed in 1990, and he said, "We live in a world where amnesia is the most wished-for state. When did history become a bad word?" So I want to take a little bit of a historical perspective on this issue, kind of look backwards a little bit, and look at what we're up against. Humanity is up against. We're up against our traumatic past as a whole species, and particularly our powerful tendency to repeat solutions of the past, whether or not they are still working or not. We're very well suited biologically and psychologically to deal with that, which Barbara Ehrenreich has called the original trauma of not a single event, but a long-standing condition of being hunted by animals and eaten. We're really good at dealing with those kind of situations. Not so great at dealing with life today, where there are a lot of stressors that are not really life-threatening, but that still cause the same levels of physiological arousal. And that turns out to be a real problem. This is an ancient headline, really, way in advance for the ACES study. What society does to its children will do to society. And this is the groundwork for epigenetics, which we're discovering there are probably very significant genetic, meaningful responses in terms of what gets passed on to the next generation. This is, of course, from the Bible, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. And science is beginning to demonstrate that that is, in fact, true, that what happens to us can get passed down through the generation, through our genome. Well, the 20th century was a pretty rocky road for us. I'm spinning us way ahead because Angela says I only have, like, not very much time. So I wanted to, though, share with you this amazing man who was a psychiatrist. He was one of the first presidents of the American Psychoanalytic Society. He lived through the First and the Second World War. And he said, individual discourse is but the symptom of a social discord. And it is futile to attempt to remedy mental disease occurring within the individual mind as long as psychiatry remains blind to the existence of mental disease within the social mind. Yeah, well, this was, the 20th century is called the century of megadeath. So what that circle in the middle is that through the 20th century, 980 million people were killed by other people. So many of us lived from the last half of the 20th century, but that's the kind of trauma that humanity has been through. And by the 60s, R.D. Laing, the radical psychiatrist, saying alienation as our present destiny is achieved only by outrageous violence perpetrated by human beings on human beings. No man or woman can begin to think, feel, or act now except from the starting point of his or her own alienation. And then by the 70s, another psychiatrist, Eugene Brody, was saying the major dilemma for us as mental health professionals lies in the fact that primary prevention of mental handicaps and the assurance of overall community health is total. It involves the whole social system and is thus beyond his power as well as his expertise. So that's where we landed in the 70s, is that, wow, the enormous social problems that cannot be handled solely on an individual basis. Trauma studies began really post-Vietnam War. And we started to really talk about what trauma really meant. And by 1988, Roland Summit was saying, hey, what if we're protecting a massive societal blind spot? He was one of the people early in the field, like David Corwin, of understanding the whole issue of childhood sexual abuse. What if judges have been trained not to hear, doctors schooled not to see, and psychiatrists encouraged not to believe? What if the instruments of social scientists have been calibrated to filter out an insistent static of post-traumatic pain that is central to the origins of violence and emotional disturbance? And that is, in fact, of course, what we have discovered, is that we have been systematically blind to what was really going on. And what's emerging as a result of all the ACES work is, wow, that has been there all along. It's not new, it's just that we didn't make the connections. Well, why not? Well, because through the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of social unrest. Huge cultural shifts were occurring. Many of you probably participated, I know I did, in at least some of these. And what do human beings and human groups inevitably do when faced with complexity? We reduce things as much as we can. So there are different kinds of reductionism. This is what happened to psychiatry, that everything is caused by biology, chemistry, and genes. And so we started doing things that only really support treatment on a biological level. Psychological reductionism is everything is in the individual. And the people are either sick or they're bad. And then you get schools of silos of knowledge that are separated from each other, and they don't integrate or communicate. Social reductionism, it all causes cultural. It's all racism, or it's all poverty. It's all things that are cultural. And spiritual reductionism, none of that matters. It's all cause is non-human, incorporeal, or supernatural. So that's where our culture is now, I think, is that we're vastly reduced. And a 20th century philosopher, Owen Barfield, said, we've come to know more and more about less and less as a result of that reductionism. Well, in 1996, Fred Turner had treated Vietnam vets, and he wrote, Americans today inhabit a post-traumatic world of fragmented, conflicting narratives, each true to a degree and each in part false. If we are to take effective action in the years ahead, we must allow the psychological wounds of the past to close. If we are to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, we must also continue to run our fingers along the scars. And that's what looking at adverse childhood experiences is for individual people and for groups of people and for a whole country. It's running our fingers over the scars and not allowing what's happened to be forgotten, but not being dominated by it. So what we're up against is our own biology, our own psychology, our own social dynamics as a whole species, not individuals, but all of us are up against that. And H.G. Wells put it very well after living through the First World War. He said, human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. And I think that's what we're all here for tonight, is that we want it to be about education, not catastrophe. But what's going on in our larger culture? Are we actually driving ourselves towards national, global, traumatic second-order change? This is from, the internet. Got it over the weekend. This is the 10 best, get that, the 10 best post-apocalyptic movies just of 2013. So there is no best list about the greatest vision that we could have as a culture of what could lie ahead. The last people talk about that, I think, was Gene Roddenberry in Star Trek. So we have a long way to go to push our culture in a different direction, because what we intend often does happen because human intention matters. So can we consciously evolve quickly enough to avoid extinction? And at the bottom line, in terms of meaning making, I think that's why we're all here on an evening when we could be home, you know, with our feet up watching TV. But we're not, because there's a lot really at stake. We live in revolutionary, hopefully evolutionary times. Our mental models are shifting. We really are in the middle of a paradigm shift. A paradigm is a theoretical framework, and it's made up of mental models. Mental models, we all have them. They're deeply held assumptions that really are largely unconscious until you really start to think about them. But they determine much of what we think, feel, and do on a routine basis. They help our brains. We need them because our brains couldn't handle all the overload of having everything new come at us all the time. So they help our brains automatically organize information, but they tend to be self-reinforcing. So you get, you know, you end up with liberals and conservatives and red states and blue states and all those crazy divisions that we are currently living with, where we're all human beings and we've all had bad things happen to us, and we have to figure out how we're going to survive and get on to the next generation. Mental models give us a sense of coherence in the world. Antonovsky described that as having things be comprehensible so you can understand it, be manageable, and have meaning. That's what a sense of coherence is. And our mental models give us that sense of coherence in the world. Changing them, therefore, is really hard. It means that we have to make not just external adjustments, but adjustments inside our own systems of meaning, who we are as people, and our professions. It means shifts in our roles, often with a lot of uncertainty, and therefore with anxiety. And mental models, therefore, limit our ability to change. So it's pretty challenging to change your mental models, but that has what has happened to us as a result of the exposure to people who are trauma survivors and learning about adverse childhood experiences. What understanding trauma is about, it's not just acquiring knowledge, it's really about changing the way you view the world. It's changing these very basic mental models about who human beings are. Now, how many of you in the room are supervisors or administrators? Yeah, most of you. This is probably what you feel like on a Monday morning. This is probably your system, because our systems are, caregiving systems are under siege. And this is what all of your workers feel like every day when they go to work, is that all of these stressors that are upon us. And living complex systems, which is what our organizations are vulnerable to stress, particularly chronic and repetitive stress, and they're vulnerable to trauma. And the result can be as devastating on a whole organization as it is for individuals. And we call that chronic organizational hyperarousal. It's when everything becomes a crisis. You no longer are able to differentiate what is a crisis and what isn't. And that is as bad for organizations as it is for individual people. This is a short version of what it looks like. Sense that you're not safe anymore and that people can't be trusted. Not being able to regulate distress, so either suppression of emotion or too much emotional expression. Breakdowns in communication and more things in the organization or in the system becoming elephants in the room, or what in the business world are called undiscussables. Poisoning of the grapevine with inaccurate information and malignant rumors and all kinds of nasty gossip, which of course leads to increased interpersonal conflict. And the more interpersonal conflict you have, the less task-related conflict you have, which is the good stuff. Boundaries become, in living systems, you need boundaries, but they have to be semi-permeable. And in organizations that are becoming dysfunctional, boundaries are either too loose and kind of you're leaking out all over the place, or too rigid, and you have these rigid information silos, so information can't be exchanged. Under the pressure of this, organizations lose their memory, and then they will mindlessly repeat things that don't work. people stop stepping up the plate and just, I'm just going to put in my time. This is meaningless work. I just have a couple more years till I retire kind of thinking. And what has happened is the whole organization has learned to be helpless. And if it goes on too long, you develop a hostile workplace and the whole system can collapse. We call that in Sanctuary parallel process. When two or more systems, whether they're individuals, groups, or organizations, have relationships with one another, they tend to develop similar thoughts, feelings, and similar behavior. We call that destroying sanctuary. It's about the impact of stress on families, organizations, and communities. But just to put things in perspective, if you think this is bad, you have to remember what happened the last time there was a really big paradigm shift. We're talking the Renaissance. What did our ancestors bring us? The Spanish Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, and millions of women and some men were burned at the stake as witches. So when you're having a really bad day, just kind of put it in perspective. So there were some really wonderful things that came out of that last shift, the Enlightenment. We got the scientific method, which was a liberation of thought from superstition and from established authority. And we got modern medicine and technology, and basically all scientific achievement comes out of that Enlightenment, that enlightened period. And we also got individuality and human rights, which included the abolition of slavery and democracy, all came out of that last paradigm shift. But there were some downsides. The downsides were reductionism. So we keep going down through the trees and we forget that there's a forest. Nothing matters except physical cause and effect. So limiting it to that science is the only way of understanding things. And that leads to extreme materialism, the loss of the integrity of the whole, and the loss of value. So dehumanization, atrocity, and it leads to the justification of everything and anything that leads to increased material wealth or power. That's the downside of this last paradigm shift. And there was a downside for organizations, too, because the method of change became what's called social engineering, which is somebody's at the top, tell everybody else what to do. It's assumption that that'll work, that when you tell people what to do, they'll actually do it. And that once it's communicated and rolled out, it will just be, everything will be okay. You have to precisely assess, extensively plan and design, and then exactly what you do will be able to, you can do it again. You can predict it and you can keep repeating it. That's called social engineering. How's that working for our systems? Not very well at all, because it doesn't work. And 70% of organizational change efforts don't work, probably because they're based on a concept that just is not right. It doesn't work for actually the systems that we have. So we're saying goodbye to modernity, which is what that has been. What are we saying hello to? Well, we don't know yet, because we're right there. We're right in that middle space. The past has happened, and the future hasn't yet unfolded. We know what the old paradigm was. The new one is just kind of beginning to emerge. But we do have to remember in those anxiety-prone moments that life happens at the gaps. And that's where we are. We're at that gap where we can potentially do anything. And it can go in any direction at this point in time. I think ACES is the key to directing us down a path that will not lead to extinction, or at least lessens the possibilities. We are in what's been called an embodiment revolution, which means basically that we've discovered that the brain is connected to the body. I know that shocks you. But that is what we found. If you really boil down to the science of trauma and trauma theory, that would be what it is that we know now that stress does really bad things to us in every dimension, and that therefore we need to be doing something about stress, and that it's really bad for you if that stress happens over and over again, and it happens when you're a developing child. So what ACES demonstrates clearly is that context matters. Context in any way you can think about it. And that has huge implications for what we do, because it means our approaches may be able to come from many different directions. Trauma means people stand alone and abandoned by all sources of feelings of security. And what that means is a shattered sense of coherence. That when you've been traumatized, when you've been hurt, life is unpredictable, it's incomprehensible, it is not manageable, and it no longer has meaning. That's what trauma does to individual people. That's what it does to whole cultures. And then that can get passed on down through the generations. And I think that is what we're living with, is a real shattered sense of coherence as a whole culture. And what that means is that erodes the sense of faith and hope and love and all of the things that really make life worth living. So it's very hard to change effects unless you know cause. ACES tells us what we need to know about what is causing the effects that we're seeing. And we've never had that before. That is new. Most people in this room probably have suspected it, intuitively thought it, but we didn't have evidence for it, and we do now. And it is as revolutionary, Martha referred to this, it is as revolutionary as germ theory was for the 19th century. That's the big change that we're talking about. So I really have come to believe that this whole issue of exposure to adversity and trauma is a central organizing principle for humanity, of all feeling, thought, belief, and behavior that's basically been ignored for centuries. We just haven't seen it before, just like most of us in this room didn't see it at one point in their time and then saw it. And it's like the blinders are taken off, but the real situations were always there. Humanity has a very traumatic past. So it's a shift in terms of paradigm. The way we've boiled it down is from the interpretations that are now made about any human behavior that is problematic. People are either sick or they're bad, or they're both, to really understanding this is all about injury, and that you can injure human beings in an infinite variety of ways, that injuries can heal, and injuries are preventable, which is why we all have to see whatever domain we're in ourselves as part of a public health system. We each have our role to play, but it really is about improving the public health. And my pal Joe Fotorero kind of summed it up when we were beginning to understand this as we're really changing the fundamental question from it's not what's wrong with you, it's really about what happened to you. And if we can understand what happened, then the rest will follow. Now, one of the really good things that came out of the 20th century that had never existed before and that is still evolving is a human rights framework and language. It really is a social revolution, and that's really what ACES is about, is we've gone through a lot of other rights of other people, but children's rights lag far behind. And what ACES is about is really respecting the rights of children to have their basic needs met, basic standards without which people cannot survive and develop in dignity. They're inherent to the human person, inalienable and universal. Well, okay, so this is really about living systems and understanding what living systems are and the science of how complex adaptive systems change. How does that happen? Well, dealing with a living system is very different than dealing with a factory. Living system theory is a theory about how they work, how they're structured, how they interact, how they behave, and how living systems develop. And there's some paradoxes inherent in living systems. They change all the time because they're alive, just like your body is changing constantly. At the same time, they resist change. Systems do their best to try to maintain what's called homeostasis or equilibrium. At the same time, the most stable equilibrium happens when you're dead. So simple cause and effect explanations of anything break down as soon as there's interactions of more than two variables. So we can't really apply the same research methods as we're kind of accustomed to. Simple solutions to complex problems don't exist. And all of our significant social problems are complex, and they are nonlinear, they're not predictable, all kinds of things can happen that are unexpected. But our preferred solutions are usually simple and linear, and therefore they're doomed to really fix the enormity of the complex problems we have. We got to be thinking about, so how does change occur? Well, it occurs in two ways. First order change is doing more or less of something we're already doing. Second order change is deciding or being forced to do something entirely different that we haven't done in the past. Two different kinds of change, and living systems do both. First order change is doing more or less of something, it's reversible, it's top down, restore homeostasis. It's what you do if you don't like to exercise and you join the gym and you go the first week every day. And then the next week you go 3 days, and the next day, just one day, and then you don't go. And then you sit up with your feet on the couch and enjoy television. That's your system going back to its equilibrium point. So we try to, that's what happens in our system. New learning is not required, and the same old story can still be told. Second order change, the symbol of that is always a butterfly. And it is sudden and unpredictable. It's a new way of seeing things. It's irreversible. It often begins not in the formal system of power, but in the informal system. It requires us to learn new things, and a new story gets told. You can't make transformation happen. You can remove the obstacles and create the context for transformative change to occur. And that means you have to learn in a different way as a system. And this is what our systems have to struggle with. Single loop learning is just looking at what we do, looking at the results, and then trying to do what we do better. Double loop learning is we still do that, but when it's not working out the way we want, we go back and question our underlying assumptions. And we need both if our systems are going to change. But how does that work? Well, the way second order change works in chaos theory is that a system is stabilized by a series of attractors that are kind of like magnets circling around it, and they keep the system in line. And something can come along to disturb it, but really quickly your system will go back to its equilibrium point and it'll stabilize. These are called equilibrium-seeking processes. Something comes along that could disturb the equilibrium, but you have these processes that get it back in balance. If that doesn't happen, if the system continues to be what's called turbulent, and the first order adjustments don't work to get the system back in line again, then the system is now in this amazing place called the edge of chaos. And the edge of chaos really isn't chaotic at all. It is where all innovation, creativity, and transformation takes place. So when you are really the least stable is often when you're often the most creative, and where there is an opportunity for very different things to occur. But that place makes us really scared. And we are very uncomfortable because things are no longer predictable. And it is, however, where change is possible, but it needs to be released. How does that happen? A different paradigm has to exist or it won't happen. And we haven't had one for decades. We've been struggling with this emergent change because we didn't have a new paradigm. One is emerging. And that means there have to be a real clear articulation of what are called strange attractors to get a system to move from one stable place to a whole different place. And that means it has to self-organize. It can't be controlled from the top. A system has to go through this chaotic, turbulent time, and then it'll either become more complex or it'll deteriorate, and it's really a matter of life or death. Self-organization is a process, a pattern that emerges out of these conditions, and it can't be made by one person from the outside. An emergence is the outcome of self-organization. It is a new state or a new condition. And that's what we have to be aiming at, is emergent change. What ACES is telling us is that aiming at individual change is necessary, but it is not going to be sufficient. We do not have the time to waste waiting for individual change when there are so many lives at stake. Our systems of care need to figure out how to do second-order transformative change. And it always involves risk, always, because any change involves risk. But the clock is ticking for every kid in America. There's a lot at stake. It's really actually urgent. So there are obstacles to transformative change, many of which you will recognize. A lack of knowledge, perverse incentives, so it keeps things just the way they are, little double-loop learning, a history of entrenched bureaucracy, limited resources, inadequate, ill-informed leadership, not enough participation from people on the ground, and insufficient time for collaboration, and in many places a pretty demoralized workforce. But maybe the biggest obstacle to change is that when change shows up, something that has been there stops and something new begins. And that means all change involves loss. And human beings don't actually resist change, we resist loss. We don't like it at all. So the current attractors that are keeping our systems in equilibrium culturally now: money, power, fame, fear. That's it. So how do you create a context for emergent, transformative change? Well, you got to know that the paradigm is different and be thinking about it, that we live in an interconnected world, that everybody affects everybody else, and it's a living system. Every part of it is alive. And therefore, we have to develop methods to allow systems to self-organize. Systems are, it's called sensitive dependence on initial conditions in chaos theory, and that's really about childhood. It's about how childhood impacts us, can influence the future, but it doesn't determine it. In fact, there's an almost infinite number of possibilities that are unfolding every minute. Our brains are still neuroplastic, and human intention can change the brain, and it can change the future. But it means we have to understand what science is telling us about all the different domains of ourselves and how our development is affected by trauma and adversity. It means connecting people to other people, because healing requires other people. And that means what ACES is telling us is that people are sending out messages from their whole lives. And that if we look at symptoms as messages out to the social world that I've been injured and I'm not okay and I need help, it changes things a lot in our systems. And we have to change our definitions of what is therapeutic, because we don't have the time for only individual approaches to treatment. We have to be thinking about what treatment really is, what is therapeutic. And maybe it's anything that gives people a sense that life makes sense and is meaningful. So for individual or system transformative change, we need new and strange attractors at a system level and at a cultural level. What would those be? Love. Kenny's going to talk more about that. Safety, trust, healing, health, freedom, participation, connection, fulfillment, and meaning. That's what has to draw, what we need to draw people towards. That's what's in it to make change, is something better comes out of it that you don't know yet because you haven't experienced it if you've been really hurt. So Sanctuary is designed to be a system that pushes systems into far from equilibrium conditions if people really work the program. It's really about sharing knowledge, sharing values that we call the sanctuary commitments, sharing a language, sharing a practice, and sharing a mission, which is a parallel process of recovery for everybody that is in the system. And the idea is to bring all those shattered pieces together that trauma does and have some real coherence in the whole system. The truth is that we're in a time of transition. It's an in-between period when the old is dying and the new has yet to be born. The values, assumptions, and structures that have governed us for so long have come to their logical end, and we find ourselves at a dead end. But an American philosopher named Lewis Mumford said, every transformation has rested on a new metaphysical and ideological base, and upon deeper stirrings and intuitions whose expression includes the form of a new picture of the cosmos and the nature of man. And I think that is what we're getting from all the science around ACES, is a new picture of what human beings are. We have some choices to make. What are we going to do in the combination of human intelligence and our technology? Are we going to make heaven, or are we going to make hell? It's still a choice. We can still pick the door we're going to go through, but it has to be a collective we, so we have to figure out processes that allow us to do things consciously and collectively. Robert Frost said, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So I think the question we need to be asking all the time, maybe we ought to try to go down some more roads that are less traveled, that are not as, and they won't necessarily, in the beginning at least, be the evidence-based roads. They may be all kinds of things that have yet to be tried. So I'll end with Trigant Barreau, who said in 1950, after going through that whole first half of the 20th century, he said, man has need of a deeper basic consciousness, a consciousness consistent with his essential continuity as a race. Reason cannot operate as long as man continues to violate so essential a principle as that of the solidarity of the species. I'm done, Angelo. Did I do it?